Last year, when I saw the newest 007 film Spectre, I came home really wanting to play a Bond game, but one I hadn't played before. Lucky for me, when I bought my original Xbox on eBay so many years ago, it came with the 007 game Everything or Nothing. Upon playing it, I wondered what other James Bond games I had missed out on growing up, and how long have 007 games actually been around for. For the longest time I thought that everything had started with GoldenEye, but looking into it, there's even more games than movies. And it all started way back in 1983, with the Atari, ColecoVision, and Commodore 64 game simply titled James Bond 007. Developed and published by Parker Brothers, in this game you control James's car, a car that can not only drive on land but also through the sea. You have to shoot diamonds out of the sky whilst dodging enemy projectiles. And that's pretty much all there is to it. Try to get a high score, and when you lose all your lives, you start over again. Nothing terribly memorable, though hearing the Bond theme on Atari is kinda cool. In the next 10 years, 10 more Bond games would be released. In 1985, not one, but two vastly different games would come out, both titled A View to a Kill, based on the movie of the same name that also came out that year. The first, developed and published by Domark, was a more action-oriented game. Bond would have to traverse a mine collecting codes in order to stop a bomb. In another mission, he would have to escape a fire-ridden building, collecting keys to open doors and buckets of water to halt the progress of the fire. A third mission even had him commandeer a taxi, trying to catch up to the villain Mayday, all whilst avoiding roadblocks and police cars, significantly upping the ante from the game only released 2 years prior. The second A View to a Kill game, however, had no action at all. Well, not in the traditional sense. Developed by Angelsoft and published by Mindscape, it was a completely text-based game where the player would type in actions for 007 to perform. A year later, Angelsoft and Mindscape would release another completely text-based Bond game, Goldfinger, obviously based around the 1964 film of the same name. This was the last time we would see a text-based James Bond game. In 1987, the Living Daylights Bond film got its own video game adaptation. Developed by Melbourne House and published by Domark, this time it was a much more straightforward shooter. As Bond, you would move through the levels horizontally, shooting not only enemies in front of you, but also in the background. It seemed they couldn't wait 2 years for the next Bond film to come out, so again they looked to the past and made Live and Let Die into a video game. Developed by Elite Systems and published by Domark, they didn't adapt the whole movie though, just that one boat chase scene. Although, interestingly enough, it wasn't initially planned as a Bond game at all. Domark saw Elite Systems working on a game titled Aquablast, and thought that the boat driving and combat reminded them of the boat scene in Live and Let Die, and thus it became a Bond game. This would not be the last time a different game would be repurposed as a 007 video game. In '89, another Bond film was released, License to Kill, so of course this meant another game adaptation. Developed by Quixel and published again by Domark, this time around the game was a top-down, vertical-scrolling shoot-'em-up. Levels within the game included helicopter chases, underwater diving, and you're even able to get behind the wheel of an 18-wheel tanker truck. The next year Domark was right back at it, publishing yet another Bond game. But of course no Bond movie came out in 1990, so it was back to an older film, The Spy Who Loved Me. Developed this time by the Kremlin, it was another top-down vertical-scrolling shooter, though it did have a few static first-person shooting segments to mix up the gameplay. That very same year, a game developed by Delphine Software International came out called Operation Stealth, a point-and-click adventure where you play as John Glames, a CIA secret agent tasked with tracking down a high-tech stealth plane in Latin America. Now what does this have to do with James Bond? Well, when Interplay Entertainment published it in the United States, they changed the title to James Bond 007 The Stealth Affair, and just changed the protagonist's name from John Glames to James Bond, and hey presto, another 007 game. There was already one Bond game out that year, did they really need another? Well, 1991 came and went. For the first time since '84, there wasn't a Bond game released. While the previous games had come out on various different home consoles and computers, it wasn't until 1992 that Nintendo consoles were graced with a 007 game of their own. James Bond Jr. was released on both the NES and SNES. The game was actually based off the cartoon series of the same name, which was inspired by the 1967 novel The Adventures of James Bond Jr. 003½. They all follow the escapades of James Bond's nephew James Bond Jr. Whilst both versions of the game were developed by Eurocom and published by THQ, the Super Nintendo release incorporated vehicle-based levels into the side-scrolling platforming action, a feature which the NES version lacked. James Bond Jr. may have been a Nintendo exclusive, but that didn't mean the series would stay that way. In 1993, James Bond 007 The Duel came out on Sega systems. Another game published by Domark and developed by The Kremlin, it was released on the Master System, the Mega Drive/Genesis, and even the handheld Game Gear. This was to be the last 007 game that Domark would be involved with. Like James Bond Jr. before it, it was another action platformer, but unlike any other game up to this point, the story was not based on an original Fleming novel, spin-off series, or Bond film. Yes, even the 1983 game did have levels based on Bond movies, if you can believe it, and the stealth affair wasn't a true 007 game. I only point this out as after 93, about half of all Bond games released would feature original plotlines. Although 1983 through to 1993 yielded 11 James Bond games, none were really great or even memorable. Some were good, most were very mediocre or just flat out bad. It wasn't until the next release did the 007 video game series hit massive mainstream success, both critical and commercial, changing people's expectations of what a James Bond game could be and should be.